Recently, I read an article about 3 New York City railroad workers who were suspended after it was discovered that they had a man cave under Grand Central Station in New York City. The man cave had a flat screen TV connected to a streaming network, a fridge fully stocked with beer, a microwave, workout equipment, and furniture. Metropolitan Transport Authority found it locked behind a door. In February 2019, they received an anonymous tip that someone told them about the room where the railroad workers would hang out, get drunk, and party. Okay, these 3 railroad workers. Grand Central Station managers had no idea the room existed. It didn't appear on any of their maps of their facility. Whoa. One of the inspectors said this: "Many a New Yorker has fantasized about kicking back with a cold beer in a prime piece of Manhattan real estate, especially one this close to good transportation, but few would have the chutzpah to commandeer a secret room beneath Grand Central Terminal and make it their very own man cave sustained with MTA resources and maintained at our riders' expense." You see, Grand Central Station, if you've been there before, is a prime piece of property. You're probably looking at thousands of dollars a month just to rent this man cave out if it were available on Airbnb. These railroad workers could not afford this property, so they took it. They made it their own. I think this took some narcissism about this. These guys one day got together and said, "Fellas, let's keep this to ourselves, but I found a room that's not on any map, and we can make it into our very own man cave. This is for us. No one else can know." I think it took some materialism. They knew that this was a prime piece of real estate. I don't know if they slept there some. I don't know what happened after the party, but they knew that this piece of property was unlike any other, especially in location to their work. And I think it took some hedonism. I think they were pleasure seekers. They had a fridge full of beer, right? And they were down there to party, and they had their flat screen just like they liked it with their streaming service. And so these guys exhibit what we're going to talk about today. How many of you guys back in the day listened to Gloria Estefan and the Miami Sound Machine? Anybody out there? The only song that I could recall of theirs is this one, "The Rhythm is Going to Get You." Okay? We could all sing it right now if we had to, but today when I was preparing for this sermon, I thought of that song, and so today I don't often do sermon titles, but I'm going to title this one, "The Ism is Going to Get You." The ism is going to get you. Let me explain. Today, we're going to talk about narcissism, materialism, and hedonism from a biblical perspective, not from a Miami Sound Machine perspective. And so, narcissism, as you know, is the excessive focus on oneself. Psychology today defines it like this: narcissism is characterized by a grandiose sense of self-importance, a lack of empathy for others, and a need for excessive admiration, and the belief that one is unique and deserving of special treatment. So you and I know some people that are narcissists. Materialism is just that excessive focus on money. It's the love of money. And hedonism is just seeking after pleasure. That someone who is a real hedonist would really get on board with a fridge full of beer and let's get drunk and party, that kind of mentality, that is a pleasure-seeking person. You see, these 3 isms are what every commercial is focused on. If you got a chance later this week, yesterday maybe while you were watching some SEC football or ACC football, or some of you were watching football, right? It was my first time to see commercials in a while, and these commercials would roll by, and each one of these commercials is aimed at one of these isms. So next time you and your spouse, you and your roommate, maybe just yourself, you and your kids are sitting on the couch and you're watching some TV and you're just thinking, hey, what was that commercial focused on? Was it focused on hedonism? Was it on materialism? Was it on narcissism? You'll find that most every commercial is aimed at one of those isms in your heart because they are out to get us. And so today, as we look at this, I want us to see what the Bible says about this and how it addresses it very clearly and with truth. If you have a Bible, and I hope you do, turn to 2 Timothy chapter 3. 2 Timothy chapter 3. Paul writes this, "But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty. For people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasing, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power. Avoid such people. For among them are those who creep into households and capture weak women, burdened with sins and led astray by various passions, always learning and never able to arrive at a knowledge of the truth. Just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so these men also oppose the truth. Men corrupted in mind and disqualified regarding the faith, but they will not go very far, for their folly will be plain to all, as was that of those two men." So let me give you a big idea. If you picked up our latest edition of the bulletin, it has a little place for you to make notes. If you're not a note taker, that's a great place to start. But let me give you the big idea of 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 9, is this: cultural Christianity distorts our love of God and hatred of sin. Cultural Christianity distorts our love of God and hatred of sin. One more time. Cultural Christianity distorts our love of God and hatred of sin. You see, that love of self fights against the love of God. And this works inside and outside of us. We're being attacked on the inside. We're being attacked on the outside. And so let me give you three things that we're going to get to the very end. And the application is going to come at the end of the sermon instead of smattered in between. But it's this: to fight narcissism, we walk in humility. To fight narcissism, we walk in humility. To fight materialism, we give generously. To fight materialism, we give generously. And last, to fight hedonism, we serve others. To fight hedonism, we serve others. Like when you were just listening to verses 1 through 9, Paul is taking us through the moral sewer. Even when I'm reading all of these descriptions out loud, it feels uncomfortable to say them over and over. It's just, there's 19 expressions of sin as Paul sees it in godless people. And really you just have those in those two verses, in verses 3 and 4, or verses 2 through 4, right? He also describes the emptiness of godless religion. He then discusses the corrupt nature of the false teachers, including their evil method of proselytizing. And Paul tells Timothy, avoid these people, that's a very strong lingo. So we're going to get to that in just a little bit. But in chapter 2, verse 25, Paul holds out hope that some of Timothy's opponents might be granted repentance and come to the knowledge of truth. But we see here that some people will never arrive at the truth. Verse 7 tells us. Some are obstinate, disruptive people, and they must be avoided. To avoid them might even mean completely to break fellowship with them. Of course, let's hear this correctly. Believers should not avoid contact with all unbelievers. If you did that, you mean you never leave your house, right? But the individuals in view here are those who are within the church. And they are wrecking the lives of others, and leaders must guard the flock against these wolves, and believers must avoid the example of the ungodly. And so you're going to get to verses 10 through 13, and we're going to see a godly example. But in these 9 verses, we see ungodliness. So let's take it verse at a time. Verse 1 says this, "But understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty." Sometimes when we hear that word, the last days, our mind immediately jumps to the end times, right? But the last days are not only the days immediately preceding Jesus' second coming, they began at Pentecost and will continue until that day. In other words, we've been and are still living in the last days. In his Pentecost sermon, Peter says this about the last days, that God would pour out his Spirit on all humanity. And he proclaimed that this prophecy from Joel had now been fulfilled. He does that in Acts chapter 2 and in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 1. Timothy, see, we've talked about how he's battling these false teachers. He's battling critics even within his own church. He's battling physical hardships and his other sufferings. None of these should surprise him. Paul has over and over warned him of these. These are the realities of living in a fallen world. These are difficult times. Would we agree? There are people all around us that model these very things that we're talking about. So what's the problem in the last days? The problem Paul points out to us is simple. It's us. It's people. That sinful people who live corrupt lives will create difficult times. And some of these people under the influence of the devil, chapter 2, verse 26 says, will pose as teachers and lead other people astray. You can see some other list of sinful vices in Romans chapter 1 or 1 Timothy chapter 1. Where Paul lists some other things that really are sinful vices in people's lives. So let's look at verses 2 through 4. These are the 19 expressions of sin. "For people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, heartless, unappeasable, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of money." You see, these people are loving the wrong things. Their lives are totally self-centered. Listen to some of these phrases about their loves. Lovers of self, lovers of money, unloving, not loving good, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Everyone worships something or someone. And one's life is a spillover of that supreme love. So let's put them in three categories today. Is narcissism is that love of self. Materialism is that love of money. And number 3 is hedonism, is the love of pleasure. The other day I was trying to look at all these 19 expressions, and I tried to group them in my mind into these 3 categories. So I just took out an old-fashioned piece of paper. I know I'm supposed to just use a computer, but I took my journal out and I started making these headings up there. And I put these 3 headings at the top: narcissism, materialism, and hedonism. And I took these 19 expressions of sin in these verses and I put them into one or more of those categories. And here's how it kind of broke down for me. You might break it down a little different, but under narcissism, I listed lovers of self because that's what narcissists are, right? But I also put proud, arrogant, abusive, disobedient to parents, unholy, heartless, slanderous, brutal, not loving good, treacherous, reckless, swollen with conceit. When I preach, I use the English Standard Version, so you might have the NIV or the NASB or the Christian Standard Bible, and it might have a little twist on those, but they mean the same thing. And so when you're looking at that list, I put a stack of them under narcissism. And then under materialism, I listed lovers of money, ungrateful, and unholy. As a matter of fact, I put unholy under all 3 because it just seemed to fit, right? And so then under hedonism, I listed lovers of pleasure, disobedient to parents, unholy, unappeasable, without self-control, not loving good, and reckless. To be honest, I could have put without self-control and brutal and treacherous and reckless under each heading. As you think about people in your own life that are narcissists, that they're brutal sometimes. You think about people that are materialists, that they're brutal people. You think about people that are materialists and hedonists, these people oftentimes are reckless. And these isms or excesses lead people not to love what is good. In 1 Timothy, Paul deals with the issue of the false teachers' inordinate loves, especially their love of money in 1 Timothy 6, 5 through 10. But as you and I look at these 19 expressions, you start to see the ripple effect of people's sin. It goes like this. When someone is proud and arrogant, they will be abusive. When someone is disobedient to their parents and brutal and reckless, these are things that are the overflow. Because I was trying to think of about a way to put this the other day, and I just think our sin has shrapnel. That there is a ripple effect of our sin. It just doesn't affect us. It affects those around us, particularly those closest to us. I'll just tell you this, as a husband and a father, my sin, the ripple effect starts in my own home and then extends from there. These self-centered people have corrupt relationships, and the splash zone of our sin gets real big real fast. Our narcissism can lead us to be abusive. Our arrogance and pride can cause us to be abusive. Our love of self can also cause us to be disobedient to our parents. Our materialism, our love of money can cause us to be ungrateful. It is never enough. Our hedonism, our love of pleasure can cause us to be disobedient to our parents. I remember what it was like to be a child and a teenager and then a college student. And there were times when there was friction in my house because I was a hedonist. Because I was seeking after pleasure, and so therefore I was disobedient to my parents. Or sometimes I remember a certain Christmas where my parents gave me something I did not want as my big gift for Christmas. And I remember pitching a fit, as though I deserved something on that day. And I look back at myself and think, how big of a materialist was I? How big of a narcissist? And the problem is, it did not end there. I told Shelley the other night I was staying up. We're looking for another car right now. And as I was scrolling through cars, I would just come upon them and I would be like, I want that. And there's a battle going on within us to say, how much is enough? But we look at these other relational sins. When someone is heartless or unloving, it has ramifications in their home and at work and at school. If somebody is unappeasable, they're not satisfied, they're irreconcilable, they have a problem on sports teams. If someone is slanderous, that has a ripple effect. Someone is brutal. Someone is treacherous. We don't even have to look outside of our family tree for examples of these types of people. But if we look outside our families, we can easily find examples of narcissism and materialism and hedonism. I'll just tell you, you go shopping here in Sumter on a Friday or Saturday afternoon, and you will see demonstrations of all of these. It doesn't take very long. But narcissism, materialism, and hedonism, they steal our love for God and others. When these isms get you, we disobey the great commands in Matthew 22, 36 through 40, which says this, Teacher, someone's asking Jesus, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. You see, church, sin separates us from God and others. Let's look at verse 5. Having the appearance of godliness but denying its power, avoid such people. These people are religious, but they deny the power of God. We started our time in these verses with this big idea. Cultural Christianity distorts our love of God and hatred of sin. So some of you may not be familiar with this term. So what is cultural Christianity? Let me try to explain this. Some of you today here on the front lawn with us, some of you online today, were saved out of religion. You grew up in churches and families that had the appearance of godliness, but they were not godly, right? Some of you were very good at going to church, but your heart had not been changed. As you drive around Sumter, as you drive around many cities in America, what you will start to notice is there are many buildings that are churches. And some of them have steeples, and some of them have a cross on top of the steeples. Some of them have a reference to them about being a Christian church. There's a certain denomination, or this denomination, or this denomination. But when you go inside, you will see pews and even a pulpit. And some of them, you see a table that reads, "Do this in remembrance of me." And inside of these buildings, they do the Lord's Supper, and they practice baptism. And their pastors have been to seminary, and they open the Bible, and they sing songs about God, and they take up an offering. But yet, brothers and sisters, something is missing. You see, when some of you grew up in a church like this, I know my wife did. She grew up in a church that had all of those things and more. But what was missing was the gospel. They never talked about the gospel. They were a shell, a husk with nothing on the inside but fluff and feelings. And they were going through the motions, but no one stopped to say to themselves, let's talk about the gospel. They even would go on mission trips, and they would build and repair houses. These churches do. But when they go on those trips, they fail to mention the gospel. They fail to mention the good news that God, the loving ruler and creator of the world, sent His one and only Son, Jesus Christ, to earth to rescue sinners, of which you are one. So I'm not here just building a house, but I want to tell you about the rescue plan, which included God sending Jesus to live a sinless life and dying a criminal's death on the cross, and He resurrected from the dead 3 days later, and you must confess your sinfulness. Friend, you need a Savior, and believe and trust in Jesus alone. You see, in cultural Christianity, their religion is a show. They have external practices, but they are morally corrupt. And the leaders of these religious systems are phonies, and they are to be avoided because they have no substance. You see, cultural Christians not only lack spiritual power, but they deny it. And brothers and sisters, where Christ is not recognized, there is no power. Where the gospel is not preached, there is no power. There is only behavioral modification, which will get you to about Monday morning at 10. If you and I practice just behavioral modification, it doesn't last very long, but the gospel is what changes you and I from the inside out. You see, in America, we encounter a lot of cultural Christians. So many of them think they are saved. The hardest part for me doing evangelism, especially in the Southeast, is convincing someone they are lost. You see, in East Asia, when I would talk to people about Jesus, they would just say it. They would say to me, "Tim, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in Jesus. I don't know much about the Bible, but I don't believe in that either." And so, to be honest with you, I thought it was a better starting point. I didn't have to exhaust myself convincing them that they were lost. They knew they were lost. They knew that they were not a Christian. But friend, if you're here today and you've been coming to church your whole life, and what I just said about the gospel, about it being the good news, that God wants to reconcile you to Himself, if you've never heard that, then I would love to talk to you after the service. I'd love us to grab a cup of whatever you drink, and I'll drink some sweet tea, and we'll talk about the gospel. It is the good news, and it is for you. So come find me after the service. Let's set up a time to talk. Jesus spoke his most intense words to religious leaders. In his sermons, he called the scribes and Pharisees, he called them hypocrites and fools and blind, and he even called them a brood of vipers. I don't know about you, but I haven't been called a brood of vipers lately, but it's not a compliment. Jesus is merciful to those whose lives are a mess and who admit they need him, but to those who play the hypocrite, there is nothing but rebuke from Jesus. So look with me in verse 6. For among them are those who creep into households and capture weak women, burdened with sins and led astray by various passions, always learning and never able to arrive at a knowledge of the truth. Just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so these men also oppose the truth, men corrupted in mind and disqualified regarding the faith. But they will not get very far, for their folly will be plain to all, as was that of those two men. You see, verses 6 through 9, their tactics are evil. They try to win converts to their wicked religion. They creep into households. When you hear that word creep, it's not a good thing. They try to capture their victims. John Stott notes that this verb would mean to take prisoners in war. That they tried to capture households and homes. One commentator said that these homes might have been the spacious homes of the wealthy where the church often met, and they were trying to capture those places to make them non-effective for the gospel's sake. And Paul is not using this as a description of all women, but rather those who are immature and childish and silly and weak, and especially those burdened down with sins. Because of their unclean consciences, they were open to hear anything, even the messages of these false teachers. The false teachers preyed upon their moral weaknesses and their gullible nature. These women would listen to anybody, but they were never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. John Stott adds that this method of preying on women is a timeless tactic of false teachers. He said this, choosing a time when the menfolk were out, presumably at work, they would concentrate their attention on weak women. This expedient, comments Bishop Ellicott, was as old as the fall of man, for the serpent first deceived Eve. It was also employed by the Gnostics and has been the regular ploy of religious commercial travelers right up to and including the Jehovah's Witnesses of our day. Is it a surprise to you sometimes that the Jehovah's Witnesses knock on your door in the middle of the day? It's not a surprise to us, right? Because they are targeting people. And in verse 8, Paul alludes to the Egyptian sorcerers who opposed Moses before Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 7, verses 11 through 12. The words Jannes and Jambres, you won't find them in the Old Testament, but extra biblical sources kind of give those guys that names. They're the ones that when Aaron threw down his rod and it became a snake, they cast down their rods and it became a snake. These sorcerers opposed Moses like the false teachers were opposing Paul and Timothy. And so Paul says such men are corrupted in mind. They are mentally warped. Therefore, they are worthless in regard to the faith. Notice how we keep coming to the issue of truth in this letter. The war Paul describes here as a truth war. Paul talks about a knowledge of the truth in verse 7. He says, those who resist the truth in verse 8 and the false teachers' lack of understanding. You see, people have always been prone to drift to every wind of doctrine, especially to that which is new. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I loved to go to the beach with my family. We went on a summer vacation, usually somewhere down to the Gulf of Mexico, and my sister and I would get in the water while my parents kind of stayed on the beach. And so my sister and I would get out there and we'd be riding wave after wave after wave, and eventually we'd think to ourselves, we need to look and see where our condo is, where our parents are. And we would look, and it was though the condo had sprouted legs and walked off. And so I would start to look, and I would be like, this doesn't look familiar at all. I don't see mom and dad anywhere. Do you? And she would say, I don't see them. And so what we realized, though, is we had drifted down the beach. And I often, when I think back to these memories of my childhood, I often think back to my life and times in my life where I have taken my eyes off the truth, and humans have a tendency to drift. And we don't drift to safety, we drift to destruction. So when you find yourself in these moments where you're like, I'm drifting towards hedonism, I'm drifting towards materialism, that you and I need to remind ourselves that we are the ones who have drifted because there was nothing tethering us to the truth. And if we, friends, are not tethered to the truth, we will drift, and our feelings and our desires will grow and take control of our lives. And we need an army of good soldiers, of people who are teaching the truth, who will, by God's grace, preach and teach the Word with faithfulness, because eternity is at stake. So like verse 9 says, we need to make sure that their folly is plain to all. So now I'd like to get to us here at Crosspoint. We don't want to be cultural Christians. So how do we fight something that distorts our love of God and hatred of sin? Well, we fight it by keeping our eyes and our hearts on the truth. Number one is this: to fight narcissism, we walk in humility. When I think about narcissism, I think about a bit that the comedian Jim Gaffigan does. He talks about those times when you're at the gym and you're working out and you're looking at yourself in the mirror. You don't have to raise your hand. If you work out, we all know who you are, okay? So when Shelly and I bought our house, there's this mirror in our garage. The first time I got out of the car, I was like, ooh, there's a guy my size in our garage. But it was just a mirror. I guess it was there for working out, not so I could check my hair before I get in the car. And so, but Jim Gaffigan talks about these mirrors at the gym that when people are working out, this is what they do. He says, this is what they're thinking: I want to look at myself while I work on myself. I should make a recording so I can listen to myself while I look at myself, while I work on myself, as I leaf through my Self magazine and read about how myself can improve myself. Maybe I'll go to my Facebook page and look at photos of myself and read what myself has written about myself. And so you can see that it's not hard for us to be consumed with ourselves and become narcissists, right? Rick Warren, in his book, The Purpose-Driven Life, has one of the best opening sentences of a book that I've read in a long time, where he says this: it's not about you. The purpose of your life is far greater than your own personal fulfillment, your peace of mind, or even your happiness. It's far greater than your family, your career, or even your wildest dreams and ambitions. If you want to know why you were placed on this planet, you must begin with God, that you were born by His purpose and for His purpose. It is not about you. What a better way to live when we realize that life is not about us. It keeps us humble. Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4 says this: do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. I love that line in there where Paul writes, in humility, count others more significant than yourselves. So church, I want to ask us today is, listen to what you talk about the most. Is it all about you and your needs and your wants? What is important to you comes out of your mouth. Luke 6:45 says it like this: from out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. I follow a guy named Paul David Tripp on Instagram, and this week he posted a video talking about humility in leadership, but I think it speaks to us all. Listen to what he says. Humility means I won't minimize my sin and be defensive when people point out things that I haven't seen or that are not fun to see in you. It needs to be said that the foundational character quality of a good leader, a godly leader, a gospel fruit-producing leader is humility. No, I don't mean a sort of feigned public humility. I mean humility that has captured a leader's heart. Humility means the awareness of my own sin, that I care about my own sin more than I do about the sin of others. It means that every morning I wake up and I pray that God would rescue me from me. that He'd send help my way because I need help. It means I don't mock the weakness and failure of other strugglers because I am one. It means that I couldn't possibly preach or teach anything that I know I don't desperately need myself. He says this, now think about this. When you see yourself as desperately in need of grace every day, you will then give grace to other people who desperately need grace. Out of humility comes kindness and gentleness and tenderness. Out of humility comes patience. Out of humility comes the fact that I find it more joyful to comfort than to condemn. Out of humility comes my willingness to suffer. If my Lord suffered even to the point of death, why should I want to live a life free of suffering? Out of humility, entitlement is destroyed. Because I don't think this thing is about me, it's about Him. Humility means I'll never be a glory thief. I won't steal glory that belongs to the Lord. I won't take credit for what I couldn't produce on my own. Brothers and sisters, do you walk in humility? Do you minimize your sin and care more about the sin of others? Do you, along with Paul, say, I am the chief of sinners? You see, that's how we fight narcissism, that we get low. And so, church, when we walk into a room, we don't presume that the seat at the head of the table is ours. That we're not afraid to pick up the basin and the towel. That we, along with Paul, would realize it's not about us. It's about Jesus. The second one goes like this. To fight materialism, we give generously. How much is enough? I read that question in David Platt's book, Radical, years ago. And I remember I got to this chapter and I just kind of slowed down and I thought there's something in here that is speaking to my heart. David Platt writes, What if we get to the point where we could draw a line saying this is enough and I am giving away everything I have or earn above this line? What if you and I decided that having a $50,000 salary doesn't necessitate living a $50,000 lifestyle? So the question he asks is, how much do we need to live? And he gave these statistics. I'm not sure how much they've changed, but they're startling. Christians in North America give on average 2.5% of their income to their church. Out of that 2.5%, churches in North America will give 2% of their budgeted monies to needs overseas. In other words, for every $100 a North American Christian earns, he will give 5 cents through the church to a world with urgent and physical needs. Is that enough? How much is enough? If you want to fight materialism in your heart, I think you're going to need to give more than 2.5% to your local church. How much is enough? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Is it 15%? Is it 50%? As your pastor, I just think 10% is a good place to start. And some of you are like, I can't get there, Tim. I can't get there today. I can't get there tomorrow. But maybe you could take baby steps towards that. Maybe there's some excesses that you could take out of your life to where you could start saving more and more to give so that the people around the world could know Jesus. You see, church, to fight materialism, we give generously. And it's an uncomfortable conversation. We are quick to throw rocks at people that commit adultery or other sins, but we are slow to talk about money, and I just want us to be comfortable talking about this because we have got to address this issue in our heart. Because I'll just tell you that from my time in East Asia, I saw my brothers and sisters over there giving sacrificially so that others could know about Jesus. And they were not as wealthy as us. So the question you need to ask yourself is, how much is enough? And if you'd like to talk about that, if you'd like to grab the book Radical and you and I sit down and have a conversation about it, it will get real uncomfortable for both of us really fast. But I'd love to do that. The third one is this: to fight hedonism, we serve others. When we take our eyes off of ourselves and think about others, we aren't thinking about pleasure. Don't you love it when you go through Chick-fil-A and you say thank you and they say my pleasure? It is their pleasure to serve you. It brings me pleasure to serve you. This is how the church should be. If you want to talk about Christian hedonism, John Piper does a great job of this in Desiring God, when he kind of slams us with this: God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him. So here's what I want us to think of. This week, what if you found a teacher in our community and you gave them a gift card or offered to help them with a meal at their house? Because teachers around our community are struggling right now. And maybe we wouldn't think of how we could enjoy something that's pleasurable to us, but we could think of them. How can we serve you? We hear you. We know this virtual school. We know the pandemic is going on far too long, teachers, and we want to love on you. How can you serve a teacher this week? This week, if you know someone in your life who's a non-Christian, what could you do to help them? Do they need help with their kids? Do they need help with their yard? How can you and I as Christians come alongside of them? I've heard about Christians shopping for people who can't get out. What if we served our community like that? Maybe you know someone that just needs a phone call, that you could call them once a week and you could talk and you could serve them by not just focusing on yourself. You could ask them questions and let them speak. What if you served a non-Christian by asking them to read one-to-one Bible reading with you, or maybe a book of the Bible, and you decide to give up a night of TV watching and do this, or host a small group Bible study? Church, we have got to quit thinking so much about ourselves. And I speak this to myself. The one thing this pandemic has done is it has put me inside my house far too much. So we have got to get outside and realize the world is in desperate need of the gospel, and we must serve them. And not serve them without telling them about the gospel, because it's the message they need the most. Will you pray with me? Father, today my heart is heavy. Every single one of these application points, every single person on this lawn and online, we struggle with this, Jesus. That all of these things make us very uncomfortable. Because in our heart of hearts, we are all narcissists. In our heart, God, we are all materialists. We are all hedonists. And Father, you have got to reveal our sin to us and break us from that sin. Show us the death that it results in. God, we as a church want to be a light to our community. And Father, I pray that we would do some heart searching today. I pray in our Sunday school classes that we could be honest with each other and admit that we struggle with these. Because no one is surprised. No one is surprised by our struggle with sin. God, may we have a trusted brother or sister that we could pour our hearts out to. And Father, if there is a non-believer here with us today or joining us online, Father, I pray that you would convict their heart of their sin and their need to have a rescuer. And God, may the gospel ring out through your people. May we be a people that would herald hope, that we would herald life, that we would be people that would be gospel bearers. We would be gospel-centered people. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.